Every detail matters in the courtroom. Every perspective demands fairness. Know your legal protections and pursue genuine justice.
Hey, what are you doing out here, huh? Where you from? You got papers on you, or are you just hanging out?
I'm just standing here, sir. I'm from right here, born in L.A.
Yeah, you sure about that? Let me see some ID, something that says you're even supposed to be in this country.
I'm a United States citizen. I'm also sergeant with the city police department.
Two ICE agents saw an Asian man and made an assumption that would define the rest of their careers. They stopped him, surrounded him, and made it clear they believed he didn't belong here. What they didn't know was that this man had spent over 2 decades in law enforcement, had trained to handle situations far more dangerous than this one, and was already building a case in his head that would end with a federal court handing him $14.1 million. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. It was supposed to be a normal day off. No uniform, no badge on display, no radio crackling with emergency calls. Just a man running a simple errand in his own neighborhood, moving through his day the same way millions of Americans do without a second thought. That man was Stephen Liang, a 47-year-old police sergeant based in California, with over 22 years on the force. But Liang was not just any sergeant. He was a SWAT team leader, the kind of officer departments spend years building, the kind of man who trained for hostage situations, high-risk entries, and split-second decisions where the wrong call costs lives. He had spent more than 2 decades earning that position, proving himself in rooms and situations most people will never see the inside of. On this particular day, though, none of that was visible. He was in plain clothes, relaxed, just a man going about his life in the country he had spent his entire career serving. That was exactly the problem, at least in the eyes of the 2 ICE agents watching him. Agent Rick Moody and his partner had been working the area that day, and somewhere between their training and their assumptions, they made a decision that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with how Stephen Liang looked. Moody was not new to this work. He had been with Immigration and Customs Enforcement long enough to know the rules, long enough to know what reasonable suspicion was supposed to look like. But what happened next had very little to do with reasonable suspicion. The moment they saw Liang, his face, his features, something clicked in their minds that told them he didn't belong there. Not on that street, not in that neighborhood, not in this country. They moved toward him. Liang noticed them before they reached him. Years of law enforcement training had sharpened his awareness in ways that never fully switch off, even on a day off. He clocked their body language, their direction, the intent behind their movement. He stayed calm. That was also training. You don't spend 2 decades in law enforcement, years leading a SWAT unit, without learning how to hold yourself steady when a situation starts shifting around you. Where are you from? The question came fast and carried a weight that had nothing to do with curiosity. It was the kind of question designed to put someone on the back foot, to make them feel like they owed an explanation just for existing in a space. Liang answered, calmly, clearly. But the agents weren't satisfied. To them, his answers weren't the point. His face had already told them everything they thought they needed to know. They pressed further, demanded more. The tone made it clear that in their eyes, Stephen Liang was not a man going about his day. He was a problem to be solved, a case to be processed, someone whose presence required justification. What they hadn't considered, not even for a moment, was that the man standing in front of them had spent 22 years on the other side of exactly this kind of encounter, that he understood use of authority better than most people in that zip code, that he was already watching this situation with the cold, precise eyes of someone who knew when a line was being crossed. And a line was being crossed. The confrontation was only just beginning, but the damage was already being done. and Stephen Liang was taking a note of every single second of it. Stephen Liang didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He had been in enough high-pressure situations to know that the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to unsettle you is give them the reaction they were looking for. So he stood his ground, calm and measured, and did what any law enforcement officer would do in his position. He identified himself. "I'm a police sergeant," he told them. He made it clear, direct. No room for misunderstanding. The agents didn't back down. That moment, that specific moment when Liang identified himself and the agents chose to keep pushing, was the moment this situation crossed from an uncomfortable stop into something far more serious. Because this was no longer about confusion. This was no longer two agents who simply didn't recognize a fellow law enforcement officer. They had been told. They had been given the information that should have ended the entire encounter, right there on that sidewalk. And they kept going anyway. Moody looked at him the way people look at someone they've already made up their mind about. The kind of look that says the words coming out of your mouth don't matter, because I've already decided what you are. He asked Liang for identification. Liang provided it. But even with credentials in front of them, the agents treated every answer like it needed to be verified, challenged, and questioned again. The process that should have taken 30 seconds was being stretched deliberately, and the message behind it was loud and clear. We don't believe you, and even if we did, it wouldn't matter. What was happening to Stephen Liang on that street had a name. It wasn't a new phenomenon, and it wasn't unique to him. Racial profiling, the practice of targeting someone based on their ethnicity rather than their behavior, had been debated, condemned, and legally challenged in courtrooms across America for decades. But knowing the name for something doesn't make it hurt less when it's happening to you in real time. And for Liang, a man who had given 22 years to the badge, who had put himself in danger to protect communities, who had led SWAT operations that required absolute trust between officers, being treated like a suspect in plain sight was not just humiliating. It was a betrayal of everything the job was supposed to stand for. The agents moved to detain him, not suggest he come with them, not politely ask him to wait while they sorted things out. They detained him, physically, on a public street, in the middle of his day off. A decorated police sergeant and SWAT team leader was being held against his will by federal agents whose only apparent reason for stopping him in the first place was that he looked like he might be foreign. Liang remained composed on the outside, but inside, something was shifting. This was no longer just an uncomfortable encounter he could walk away from and shake off. This had become something that needed to be answered, not with anger, not with a scene on the sidewalk, but through every proper legal channel available to him, and he knew exactly what those channels were. As the detention dragged on, people nearby began to notice. A man in plain clothes, surrounded by federal agents, being questioned and held on a street where nothing had happened, and no crime had been committed. To anyone watching without context, the image itself told a story. And in America, in 2023, that image carried enormous weight. The agents eventually let him go. No arrest, no charges, no evidence of anything because there was nothing to find. Stephen Liang walked away from that sidewalk, the same law-abiding, decorated, highly trained officer he was when he woke up that morning. But something had been set in motion that the agents didn't see coming and couldn't stop. The moment they let him walk, he already knew what the next step was going to be. He wasn't just going to report what happened. He was going to make sure that what happened to him on that street, the assumption, the detention, the dismissal of his credentials, all of it, was going to be examined under the brightest legal light possible, and the people responsible were going to have to answer for every single second of it. The reveal of exactly who they had just detained was about to hit them like a freight train. When the full picture of who Stephen Leung was began to surface in official records, legal filings, and department documentation, the weight of what those agents had done became impossible to ignore. This was not a man without a voice. This was not someone who would fill out a complaint form and hope for the best. Stephen Leung was a 22-year veteran of law enforcement, a sitting police sergeant, and a SWAT team leader with a record that spoke for itself. The same federal system that employed the agents who detained him now had to sit across from his attorneys and reckon with the fact that their agents had racially profiled, stopped, and physically detained one of their own, a decorated officer with more training, more experience, and more legal knowledge than most people in that entire encounter combined. The irony was painful, and it was public. Here was a man who had spent over 2 decades running toward danger, leading some of the most high-risk operations in law enforcement, trusted with decisions that determined whether people lived or died. And 2 ICE agents had looked at his face and decided he didn't belong on an American sidewalk. They hadn't seen the badge behind the plainclothes. They hadn't considered the career behind the calm voice. They had seen his ethnicity and made a call, and that call was now sitting in the middle of a federal lawsuit. Leung's legal team laid it out clearly. What happened to him that day was not a misunderstanding. It was not a procedural error or an isolated lapse in judgment. It was racial profiling, documented, witnessed, and backed by the fact that even after Leung identified himself as a police sergeant and provided credentials, the agents continued the detention. That detail alone was devastating to any defense the agency could mount. The case was building, the evidence was solid, and the man at the center of it all had the patience, the discipline, and the legal standing to see it all the way through. The agents had stopped a man they thought had no power. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. The federal court didn't take long to see what had happened for exactly what it was. When all the evidence was laid out, when the timeline of that encounter was placed under legal scrutiny and examined piece by piece, the verdict came back with a clarity that left no room for debate. Stephen Leung was awarded $14.1 million in damages, one of the largest settlements of its kind in a racial profiling case, involving federal agents in recent American history. That number was not just compensation. It was a statement. It said that what happened on that sidewalk had a cost, that detaining a man because of his face, dismissing his credentials, and holding him against his will without cause was not a minor procedural mistake that could be quietly buried in an internal review. It was a violation of his rights, of his dignity, and of the very laws those agents were supposed to be enforcing. For Leung, the money was never the center of it. He had said as much publicly. What mattered to him was the acknowledgement, the legal record that would exist permanently, stating clearly that what was done to him was wrong. That a man with 22 years of service, a SWAT team leader who had given his career to protecting others, deserved to walk down a street in his own country without being treated like a suspect for the way he looked. The case also forced a wider conversation about how ICE conduct stops, about the assumptions federal agents carry into the field, about what racial profiling costs, not just the individuals it targets, but the institutions that allow it to happen, and the taxpayers who eventually foot the bill for the settlements that follow. Stephen Leung went back to his life, back to his department, back to the work he had never stopped believing in, even when the system failed him. That in itself said everything about the kind of man he was. The agents who stopped him that day had looked at his face and seen someone without power. What they got in return was a federal judgment, a $14.1 million lesson, and a permanent place in the record books as the people who made one of the most expensive assumptions in the history of American law enforcement. Some mistakes you don't get to walk away from.
Accountability is a shared responsibility, and facts are your ultimate protection. We appreciate your time and commitment to verifiable truth.